Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, let's discuss Megadeth and their album Countdown to Extinction. I can't help but when I think of this album, I always feel like it's Megadeth's response to Metallica's Black Album. For a few reasons, Metallica's Black Album came out in August of '91. This comes out in July of '92. And Megadeth sort of follows in the same way of thinking. They as the Black Album, in that they sort of slow things down a few notches. Although I would argue that they don't drop down as many notches as Metallica does. The shift from Injustice for All to the Black Album, I believe, is more severe than the shift from the previous Megadeth records to this one. I did a video on the Black Album. I'll leave a link to that below in the description. So there's that. There's and preparing for this, as I was reading up on the record, they acknowledged that they saw the Black Album, they saw how successful it was, and they took some inspiration for that, or maybe tried to follow that blueprint, and it worked for Megadeth. This is their most critically, commercially successful album, double platinum in the U.S. I was surprised to read that it went to number 2 in the Billboard charts, and a lot of that was off of the back of what I would consider to be Megadeth's Enter Sandman, which is Symphony of Destruction. Maybe a song I don't need to hear anymore. I'm kind of burnt out on it, just like I am a Sandman, and it's one of those songs that you'll hear it at hockey games, you'll hear it at football games. That opening riff is very iconic, and I'm not as burnt out on it as I am with Sandman, but it's one that I tend to skip over when I am listening to this record, because I have kind of heard it maybe too many times. And of course, there's a connection of Dave Mustaine, being in Metallica. But again, it always felt like to me that this album was Megadeth seeing what happened with the Black Album and saying, hey, we want a piece of that action, and, changing their sound a little bit, making the songs a little bit more focused, a little more on the song craft rather than the arrangements, rather than, pummeling, neck snapping riff after riff and stuff like that. Although, again, I would argue there is a lot of aggressive and fast stuff on this record. So it sort of surprised me when I was listening to this again. Haven't listened to it in a while. I was just surprised at how much stuff on here was pretty fast and was pretty aggressive, because in my mind I was thinking that this is them really slowing everything down and trying to be more radio and stuff like that, and it is to a certain degree, but I think they do a good job of walking that line here, where I can see people's complaint that maybe Metallica went too far with slowing things down and not really sort of changing from where they had come from before that. The musicianship on here is absolutely fantastic. I mean, Marty Friedman, he's amazing. He's a guy that got started in that whole Shrapnel Records shredder world, but he has a sense of melody on top of all his technique that I think makes him stand out from the sort of sea of faceless shredders that were so prevalent at this time. And it's also interesting to note that this comes out in '92, about a year after Nevermind comes out. So we are pretty much, grunge is just exploding. And you could say that they got in there just in time, or that this album was played, as far as changing their sound, it was a real savvy move, because it managed to keep them relevant in the early part of the 90s. I always think of Metallica's Black Album. They got that in right before grunge happened. Ozzy gets in No More Tears right before the grunge thing completely explodes, and it manages to carry them through the 90s. I would say that with Megadeth, they of course didn't have the same career trajectory as Metallica did, whereas Metallica seemed to just ride this thing to the absolute top of the pyramid. I would say that Megadeth kind of stalled out after this. Their career didn't really go higher than they were at this point in time. I remember hearing David Ellefson once tell a story about how they were just living the life, and he remembers thinking of how ridiculous it had gotten when he joked that we used to take limousines just to cross the street. If we were going from one club to another club across the street, we took a limo because we wanted to make sure everybody saw us coming out of a limousine. And I don't know if he was just joking or not, but I think it's a funny story to show how big they had gotten at this point. So for me, the album, there is a lot of really cool stuff on here, and I actually find myself wanting to listen to this record more often than I do the Black Album, and I think that's because there were so many songs on the Black Album that got played like crazy on MTV and on the radio that I'm really burnt out on about half of the Black Album. I mentioned when I made my Black Album video that if you drop all the singles from that record, you're still left with a pretty decent cool album from all the quote deeper cuts from that record. But this album doesn't really have that. Symphony of Destruction got played like crazy, and although I'm a little burnt out on that, I'm still kind of okay with that. I mentioned David Ellefson earlier. He has a really cool bass sound, and he really stands out in the mix. And on this album, it's a good example of how he doesn't do anything super fast and technical, but he does a lot of cool little things where he's just not following the riff. Like in Symphony of Destruction, there's I think it's like the last chorus or something where he sort of climbs up while the guitars are climbing down or something like that. And it's just really cool. I will say one of the other singles on here is Sweating Bullets. I can't stand that song. Dave Mustaine, I've never been a huge fan of his vocals. I think his vocals work best when he's sort of a little bit up in his range and he has a little bit of that venom and sneer to his voice. I hate when he's like half speaking, half singing, like here in Sweating Bullets when he's doing that, hello, me, is that me, or whatever the line is. Oh, I hate it, that stop-start thing. And when that one riff comes in, feeling paranoid, I just hate it. But the intro to the song is killer. I love that intro. It's so cool. But then the song just drops down. Can't stand it. I always hated the video for that. But again, there's a lot of stuff on here that works in this formula. Foreclosure of a Dream is a good example of it. The chorus is really catchy. There's some cool, real tight playing on it. The band where they're... I would say the difference here is rather than a lot of extended parts and songs where they're just playing like thrash riffs, you get little shots of it here and there where they'll play like a kind of a simple riff, but then they'll throw in a da-da-da, type of thing or something like that. That's just really, really tight. And being that this was probably before they were recording stuff with I don't think Pro Tools and things where you could cut and paste and quantize even existed at this point. So the fact that they were able to get this album this tight and this squeaky clean. And did I mention the production already? Max Norman produced this along with the band. He did the early Ozzy albums, and the production is super clear, super punchy. It's great, and it really works and shines here and shows the tightness of the band. There's something to be said about, it's one thing to play fast, but when you're playing at sort of more mid-tempo things and there's a lot more spaces in the sound, you really have to be tight and together, because those open spaces, you can hear more stuff going on rather than when everything's just thrashing away and everybody's really bombastic. When there's more open spaces, like in a band like AC/DC, where they're just locked in super, that's the sign of a tight band that can play super tight in songs that are in more of a mid-tempo type of range. Other things I really like on here, Countdown to Extinction. I think that's a great chorus. Again, another one that you can sort of see how they maybe put a little bit more emphasis on songcraft and arrangements and stuff, like getting to the point a little bit quicker with the riffs and stuff like that, and having the riffs and everything sort of serve the songs a little bit better. What else on here? Architect of Aggression, Skin in My Teeth. I think those are both really good. I love Cyclotron. That might be my favorite song on this album, actually. I just love that main riff, the way the song starts, and it call him Psychotron. That's an example of Dave Mustaine voice that I like, when he has that sort of, a little bit of a gritting your teeth together, a little bit of aggression in his voice, a tone to his voice when he sings like that. Don't really like Captive Honor. Do like Ashes in Your Mouth. I do think that that's a cool one. All right, so Megadeth, Countdown to Extinction. Let me know what you guys think. How do you compare this to the Black Album? Which one do you like better? Do you sort of agree with me that even though they did sort of slow things down on this, that it isn't as much of a stylistic change as it was for Metallica, going from Injustice to the Black Album? This came at a time, I talk about this all the time on my channel, where I drifted away from metal for a few years, like around 89 to like about 93. So I didn't get this record till probably the late 90s, mid-late 90s. Never really followed Megadeth after this. The last 3 or 4 Megadeth records, I started paying attention to them a little bit again. But for me, this was kind of the end for me. I tend to listen to this album and backwards in their discography. So, all right, let me know what you guys think of this. Let me know what you think of it compared to the Black Album and all that. And this is probably, for a lot of people, very similar to the Black Album, where this might have been their first Megadeth record, and this might have been a gateway for them into heavy metal, the same way Enter Sandman was for some. If you were 12 when Enter Sandman came out, same thing here. If you were 12 or 13 when Symphony of Destruction, that may have got you into Megadeth, which then led to Pantera, which then led to Metallica, which then led to Slayer, etc., etc. So let me know your guys' experiences, histories, and thoughts with this album. Till we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.